Hi friends, welcome to another episode of Making Disciples. My name is Chris and I am your host. I hope you are doing well. It's been a little while since the last episode, a couple of weeks off. We've had spring harvest and Easter, and now we are back. So in today's episode, I want to explore a topic that really, it's not so much discipleship, it's just understanding. What is it we actually believe, and where do we get what we believe from? And the importance of knowing how we've got our interpretations of something. So I was speaking very recently, doing a whole bunch of different lectures around the country. I've been doing a lot of teaching on the Gospel of Mark, partly because that's what my Doctor of Ministry degree was in. In sense, I spent a lot of time exploring the Gospel of Mark, seeing how it's structured, and understanding kind of what it's trying to communicate. So I'm doing a lot of lecturing, and one of the things that I talked about in the lecture is that Jesus was not a carpenter. And I unpack why Jesus was not a carpenter. And that piece of information has seemed to have broken a few people. And you see them when you're speaking, you just see their faces go like, what? It's like their eyes roll back, their jaw drops, and it's like, well, you can't be telling the truth. You know, where are you getting this from? And, I'm able to then kind of explore, why do we call Jesus a carpenter? Where does that come from? At what point did the translation of the text get to that point? And what I thought in today's episode was that I would unpack that with us, that I would essentially look with us at what does the Bible say about what Jesus did before his ministry, and how has it been translated, and how has it essentially got to where we are now. And I suppose the question is, well, why don't we actually go back to what it's actually saying rather than what we talk about it now saying? So I thought we'd explore that together. Now, what I'm doing here is I'm not trying to shake anyone's faith in any shape or form. I'm not trying to undermine anyone's faith. But what I'm trying to do is say, right, do you know why you believe what you believe? Do you know where that's come from? And if Scripture, if these pages, the text on these pages is really going to be the thing that educates our understanding of Jesus, of the Christian faith, sound doctrine, like, do you know what it actually says? And it also elevates this question of, what translation of the Bible are we using? Who has translated this for you, and what decisions have they made? So I thought we would just explore this in today's episode, looking at the history, how it got to us today, and how it might be translated, and what we might do about it. What does this mean for us? So that's what we're going to be exploring in today's episode. What did Jesus do? What was his paid gig before he went into ministry at the age of 30? What was Jesus doing? So that's what we are going to explore. Two quick things. Number one, gosh, friends, thank you for those that in recent weeks and months have bought us a coffee. And I am sat here now drinking a cup of coffee. Look, you can hear me drinking a cup of coffee that one of you has paid for. So massive thanks. We don't ask for a subscription for the podcast in any shape or form. We put it out on the internet, and we don't put adverts on there in any way. But one of the ways you can support us is buying us a coffee, and the link to that is always in the show notes. And it's a way of you kind of blessing us as we record these episodes. So number one, thank you so much for doing that. Second thing is, somebody said to me recently, "Oh, you've stopped telling us to get subscribe to the podcast and share." I'm sorry if I've stopped doing that. I should keep, as my friends keep telling me, you need to keep reminding us. If you are one of our listeners, and there is a lot of listeners who listen to the podcast weekly but don't actually subscribe, love to encourage you to do that. The reason, because when you subscribe, it tells the algorithm in whatever you're listening to the podcast on that this is really worth listening to. You should share it with other people. So subscribing, commenting, sharing, really helpful in terms of getting that message out there, this conversation around discipleship. Friends, let's dive in and let's together explore what was Jesus's paid role before he was Rabbi Jesus. So let us dive in. There is only two gospel occurrences where we are given any idea on what Jesus' family did. And the two passages, these two occurrences, one is in Mark and one is in Matthew. In the Gospel of Mark, verse 6:3, it describes Jesus as, "Is this not the tekton?" And in the passage, it goes on to describe who Jesus is, but describes, is this not the tekton? The second place it comes up, and this time it's around Jesus' family trade. And in the Gospel of Matthew 13:33, it says, "Is this not the tekton's son?" So the term here is applied actually to Joseph and not directed to Jesus, but it's implied that it's the family trade. So there's only two occurrences, only two times when this word actually appears. And a couple of reasons, scarcity matters in some ways. It's not a major thematic word in the Gospels. It's not overly important what Jesus did before he was Rabbi Jesus. So we're only giving it twice. It's not that important, really. It is a phrase that's used to identify Jesus' background, but it's never developed or it's never really explained, which really leaves us open to translating what this word is. And the word there is tekton, Tekton. There are other root words that are really helpful. So the Gospel of Matthew 7:24 talks about the wise and the foolish builders. And the phrase in the Greek there is okiodomos. Okiodomos. Oikodomos. That's translated as a builder. The wise and foolish builder. And it also appears in 1 Corinthians 3:10, where it talks about like a wise master builder. So the word that is associated for Jesus and what he does is tekton. There are other words that would describe building or builders. Now, the Old Testament is written in Hebrew, but there's a version of the Old Testament which was translated into Greek, and it's called the Septuagint. And it's the Old Testament in the Greek language. And in the Septuagint, tekton does appear slightly more often in that manuscript, and it's translated as craftsman working with wood. It translates as workers shaping stone, and it's also translated as general artisans or builders. So in the Old Testament, where the Old Testament is written in Greek, it's quite a broad term. Now, 2 Samuel 5:11 translates as craftsmen sent to build David's palace. In Isaiah 44:13, it's a craftsman shaping material. And so this phrase is not limited to carpentry. It's quite a nondescript term in some ways. But it's certainly not a word that would be translated as carpenter. It would not be boiled down to that. So I want to give you a bit of a story. So I've told you where the words appear. I want to give you a little bit of story. So Jesus is in Galilee, is in Nazareth, and if you ever get to go to Galilee and Nazareth and look around and say, right, what are the materials that we see here? What is it that people are building out of? And what you find is there really are no trees. You've got olive trees and you've got palm trees. Not really the kind of trees that you're going to be able to build anything substantial with. Housing is not made of wood. Housing is made of stone. Often dug into rocks and then built onto the front, or dug into the ground because it was cooler. If you could dig down, you were cooler underground than you were above ground. So often houses had steps that would go down to a lower area, and then they would have a bit built on top as well, so almost like a two-story kind of thing. So there's lots of different structures in different shapes. But essentially, in the first century, Nazareth of Galilee, timber was scarce, and stone was the primary building material. So historically, it's not plausible that Jesus was somebody who was working heavily with wood. If you were going to build anything with wood, it would be very chosen and scarce. So in Bethlehem, for example, the manger that animals ate from, troughs, were not made of wood. They were made of stone. You would just get a block of stone and you would carve out the middle, and that would become the crib that the animals ate from, the manger the animals ate from. So the word tekton needs to be understood and translated in terms of the context of the culture at the time. So Jesus, we're told in Mark, Joseph in Matthew, was something called a tekton, and it's firmly translated. It began firmly to be translated as carpenter in the early modern English Bible, and particularly around, you'll see this as I unpack it, but the King James Version, which is 1611, that choice to translate the word tekton as carpenter had really solidified. So what I want to do is just take you through the history. So the Bible is written Hebrew in the Old Testament, Greek in the New. People are reading it from the Greek, they're reading it from the Hebrew, and then we start to see the gospel moving out of that region. By the 4th century, we have the early Latin translations of the New Testament. And when Jerome produced the Latin Vulgate, which is the Bible in Latin around the 4th century, he translated tekton as faber, F-A-B-E-R, and broadly that will be translated as an artisan, a craftsman, or a maker. So in the 4th century, in the Latin, that the translation of tekton was very much an artisan, a craftsman, or a maker. Now when you see the word artisan, this is a master craftsman. So craftsman, you had somebody who was a trainee craftsman, had an apprentice. They would be master builders, master craftsmen, and artisan. So that was the 4th century. Well, by the medieval period, the gospel had now made its way to Europe. And in the medieval period, as it comes to Europe, you look around, what were homes being made of? Well, by the time you get to Europe, houses are no longer being made of stone, as they were in the Middle East. They're now going to be made of wood. Why wood? Because wood was readily available. You had the woods, trees everywhere, and you could simply chop down a tree, you could turn it into planks, and you could build a house. So over time in Europe, in this medieval period, the word starts to be translated in English as a craftsman. It's increasingly becoming associated at this point less with stone and now with wood. So working with wood in building of properties or buildings. And carpentry became one of the most familiar and visible crafts of the day. So what you've got is at the time, Middle East, properties were built out of stone masonry, carving of stone was the primary building material. All over Galilee and all over Nazareth, people were training in stone masonry, and they could go, and because of the Roman Empire particularly, there was mass building projects, and they were all being built out of stone. So the Latin translation of tekton becomes artisan or craftsman, or by the Middle Ages in Europe, houses are not made of stone, they're made of wood. So the word craftsman was how it was translated, but the association for somebody at that time in Europe was that a craftsman would have, had the craft of building homes, and we would know, well, as they do that, they made it out of wood. So although it's not translated as carpenter, the association with that word was more carpentry than stonemasonry. And then the first clear English narrowing down of the word tekton to actually be translated as carpenter wasn't until the 4th century, so 1382. And so less than 1,000 years ago, in other words. So over 1,000 years, it was translated in terms of a builder with stones, or understood in that way. And then it's in the 1382 translation, tekton first becomes translated as carpentry or carpenter. And then it's really cemented into the consciousness of the European readers because of the Tyndale Bible and the King James Bible. And then there's also the Geneva Bible. So the Tyndale Bible was 1526, the Geneva Bible is 1516, and then you've got the King James Bible. So by that point, tekton was now being translated as carpenter. So the narrative over it changed. And the reason it changed was where it was being translated, because of what properties were being built out of. So in the Middle East, the tekton was much more stonemasonry, building properties out of stone. Middle Ages, Europe, houses now being made of wood. So the word tekton starts to be translated as somebody who builds properties or homes out of wood, and eventually gets really solidified as carpentry. Now, I just want to look at the Gospels with you for a minute. So I'm just going to take you to some of Jesus's teachings. I think I've got every possible building reference in Jesus's teaching arsenal. So Matthew 7 and Luke 6 talks about the wise and the foolish builders. The story of two builders, one that's building on a house of sand, and one's building a house on the rock, and foundations and non-foundations. And Jesus talks about these two builders, one that's wise and one that's foolish, one that builds on a solid foundation, one that builds on the sand. And the emphasis here is not about woodwork, but it's actually about groundwork, and it's about foundation stones. It's building on top of a foundation that means your house won't tumble down when the storms come. I often think of the Three Little Pigs, house of straw, the house of wood, but actually houses were made out of stone. So if you were building house of stone on top of sand, and the storm comes, washes the sand away, the whole stone structure will collapse. So Jesus tells a parable of wise and foolish builders. It's supposed about foundation stones. Then you've got in Matthew 21, Mark 12, and Luke 20, Jesus tells a story that the cornerstone is being rejected. The cornerstone the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. So the stone the builders have rejected has become the cornerstone. And the cornerstone was the stone that you would lay down that gave you the straight lines to know where you were going to build your lines from. So your cornerstone would be put in the corner. It would help you work out how to build a straight property. And Jesus uses it as an analogy. The stone the builders rejected has become the cornerstone, which really shows that Jesus has deep knowledge of stonemasonry, selecting the right stone, shaping and the placement of stones to actually build a property that was not going to fall down. And cornerstones were often pre-cut, and they were structurally critical. And it was essential you got the right cornerstone at the right angle, laid in the right place. So the language that Jesus is using here really is construction language. It's the knowledge of how to build a property or a home or a building. And then you've got a story in Luke 14. It's only in Luke 14, and it's a story about counting the cost of building a tower. And it says in it, suppose one of you wants to build a tower. It goes on, don't you count the cost, you work out how much it's going to cost you, and then you start building the tower once you know you've got the resources to actually build it. Don't start building something unless you've got all the money to be able to do so. So Jesus is telling this analogy, and it focuses on planning, it's really about materials, and it's about completion. And the tower in that world was one where stone structures, not timber structures, were being built. So Jesus is telling the story: if you're going to build a tower, make sure you've got all the resources needed to build it so that you can actually complete the task of building. Clearly, Jesus has seen situations where people had started building something, run out of resources, and you got half-built buildings everywhere. And I just think it's another example of Jesus using stone building stories in our analogy. Luke 19 talks about the stones crying out. You know, if the believers were to be kept quiet, don't worry, the stones will cry out. Creation itself here is, the stones are calling out in their own language, the creation. But it's interesting that Jesus talks again about stones and rocks. The rocks will cry out, Jesus is saying. So even if the Christians remain quiet, the creation itself, the rocks will cry out. The very buildings that houses are built from will cry out. He then also in Matthew 7 uses stones and bread in kind of contrasting ways. So Jesus says, who gives a son a stone instead of bread? So Jesus is telling a story. You won't give your son a brick when actually what he's asking for is some bread. And Jesus kind of uses again this stone brick language as a part of his teaching. Now, this is a little bit tenuous, but in Luke 8, I just thought it's really important to mention it. In Luke 8, you got the story of the casting of the first stone. There's a woman about to be stoned, and there's been this legal dispute, and they're about to stone her. And actually, Jesus says, the one who's not a sinner may cast the first stone. So although it's not necessarily building, it's just using stony language again. Also, then, if we were to go with Mark 13, 1-2, talks about the stones of the temple and these massive stones, and Jesus responds with prophetic insight about the destruction of the temple and the rebuilding of the temple. And if you've ever been to Jerusalem, the temple stones, the stones that were used to build the temple, they are huge. I was looking at one a number of years ago. It was about 6.5, 7 foot wide and about 4 foot high. Massive stones, and they're carved and they're chiseled. They're perfect shape to be laid one on top of the other. And Jesus is referencing the quality of the building, and he just talks about, the temple's going to be destroyed, it's going to be down, but don't worry, I will, Jesus says, rebuild it in 3 days. Which is interesting, isn't it? So Jesus is saying, as a tekton, the one that works with stones, I will rebuild the temple in 3 days. Now, we know what he's talking about is actually his body in the church, and it's about his resurrection. But he's referencing, if Jesus had been a fisherman, and Jesus says, I'm going to rebuild the temple in 3 days, they go, you're a joker, Jesus, because not that building it in 3 days doesn't make him a joker, but you're joking. Jesus, you've never even cut a stone, mind you, laid a stone. You're a fisherman. But actually, Jesus is using what his skills are. I will rebuild the temple in 3 days. Well, then it becomes a joke about the time it's going to take. Really, Jesus? And then just Matthew 3:9, it says, God can raise up children for Abraham against these stones. It's just another reference of buildings and stones in Matthew 3:9. Stones are ever present in the landscape and the imagination of Jesus. So Jesus is referencing stones, and he's referencing building, and he's referencing foundations. So that's really good. We talked about the stone imagery that Jesus uses. So let's just pivot now for a second. Let's look at all the carpentry imagery that Jesus uses, because it might be actually in the New Testament there's a number of parables about Jesus and carpentry. So let's just go to them and have a look. Hang on, I've got to have some notes here somewhere, haven't I? Oh, there's got to be. Where are my notes about Jesus in carpentry? Oh, well, no, there aren't any. There aren't. If Jesus was a carpenter building out of wood, where are his illustrations of wood or building or carving? Where does he mention a table with a leg missing? or a chair that is wonky. He doesn't. He never references. The only reference you've got to wood is when Jesus says about having a speck in our own eye rather than a log in our. Well, they've got a speck in their eye, you've got a log in your own eye. That is the only time Jesus ever references wood, really, at all. So, people have made the link between Jesus dying on a cross and being a carpenter. Could he have made his own cross? Friends, there is nothing in the text of the New Testament where Jesus uses woodworking analogies. In fact, there's nothing in the entire New Testament that would come from the original language that would give us an inclination that Jesus was somebody that used or dealt with wood. So forget the word tekton. If it didn't give us any word for what Jesus did, and you simply look at the New Testament and say, what did Jesus do? Well, actually, you do see that he deals a lot with stone. He does talk about farming analogies, and he does talk about Lake Galilee and fishing, cast the net on the other side kind of stuff. There's more about fishing than there is about carpentry. And so you would look at the New Testament and go, well, let's have a look, what could Jesus' career have been? Well, could it have been in catering because he fed 5,000? Could it have actually been in fishing because he put the nets onto the other side? You would try to guess. But actually, there's nothing of a great deal of any substance that really, other than those two words, tekton, then looking at what Jesus does talk about, that would actually give us a sense of what Jesus did. So, I want to argue to you that Jesus was not a carpenter. Jesus was a stonemason, like many other young men around that region. Stonemasonry was, part of building these great buildings and homes and properties. Actually, he wasn't a carpenter, but he was a stonemason. And that's then what we see in the Gospels as Jesus talks about foundation stones, cornerstones, rejected stones, building towers, making sure you can afford it, stones crying out. You wouldn't give a stone if your son wanted bread. So it's riddled with stonemasonry illustrations. So I want to argue that's what Jesus was. He was a stone mason. And Jesus teaches really as somebody who's dug foundations, he's set stones, he's seen buildings fail, and he's understood weight and pressure and alignment. In other words, I think the parables don't just use building imagery. They think structurally. His illustrations are about structures and buildings and what would be sustainable long term. So I hope you find that interesting. Where do we land this then? Like, where do we put this? My final thought would be this. Jesus doesn't just invite us to believe something. He invites us to build a life that can carry weight. He calls us to dig down deep enough that we might have great foundations. So when the storms come, and they will come. And I think really is inviting us to build lives that do not collapse and do not fail and do not fall apart. So friends, tekton. Jesus was a tekton, not carpenter, but stone mason. I would love to hear what you make of that. What's your thoughts? Does it leave you wobbly? Or do you come away and go, wow, actually, that's quite interesting, isn't it? It is really interesting, the fact he uses all these analogies of stones and buildings. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. We would really be encouraged. So friends, until next time, grace and peace. I hope you found that interesting, just looking at the history and the translation of that phrase tekton over the different ages and how it's been understood and changed as the gospel has moved from an Eastern to a Western world. So friends, grace and peace, and we'll catch up soon.